Good morning to everybody at Sure Hope. It's a great privilege to be live streaming this message for you on this fantastic Easter morning. Blessings to everyone at the church, to Dave and Christelle, and to all the leadership, Dave Fordham. And we just pray that you will have a really great Easter, despite the fact that we are, of course, in the middle of this horrid crisis. So I'm going to read some verses from 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and beginning to read at verse 1. Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you had believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. This is Paul's summary, if you like, of the resurrection of Jesus, and he goes on to talk in the rest of chapter 15 of the resurrection of believers and how Jesus' resurrection actually guarantees our resurrection. So just to the lead up to today, obviously we had Palm Sunday, week last Sunday, when Jesus rode in triumph on the colt of a donkey into Jerusalem. Now that is a very interesting thing in itself, because he didn't choose to ride the mother donkey. He actually chose to ride the colt. Now, the word for the mother donkey is the word hamor, which literally means a chieftain, someone who is mighty, someone who is strong. So we probably use that word then to indicate someone who is a king, or at least a ruler. What he actually chose to ride was the donkey's coat, which always used to seem to me very, very odd. And the reason for that is because we don't actually see what the Hebrew word means. And the word there means foul, red, trouble, and so speaks of sacrifice. So you've got these two animals, the mother and the colt, who are actually both speaking of Messiah, because of course they're both of the same blood. They are mother and daughter, or mother and son, we're not actually told, but they both represent Messiah. The first one, the colt, represents the trouble and the blood that Jesus was going to shed in Jerusalem, mainly because, of course, they were not ready for Jesus as their king. They were not ready for the mother donkey, as it were, the chieftain, the prince, the one who was strong and mighty. That would come, of course, in the millennium, when Jesus would come and reign and rule on this earth for 1,000 years and have his capital in Jerusalem. So we know that this happened. And then following that, we have the start of Passover week, and after the 14th of Nisan, that was when Jesus was crucified. He was crucified on a cross, which is actually the old pictographic letter, the ancient Hebrew letter for the letter Tav. And Tav stands for covenant. Tav stands for God's mark or sign on something. And so Jesus died on a cross that represents God's covenant with us. And then, of course, on the night before Jesus was resurrected, late on the Saturday night, we have the start of what's called the Feast of First Fruits. And what would happen was that the high priest would go into a field of barley where he knew that the barley was ripe, and he would take a sheaf in his hand and hold a sickle in the other hand, and he would say, "Shall I reap?" Now, this usually wasn't a very important ceremony, and there was usually only a few people there, and he would say, "Shall I reap?" And they would say, "Reap." And so he would strike the sickle into this sheaf, and the sheaf would be bundled, and it would be taken back to the temple, and it would be waved before God as evidence that that was the first fruits of the barley harvest. Now, what was really that ceremony was really about was actually happening in the tomb back outside the city in the Garden of Gethsemane, because there God had the sickle in his hand. And he said, "Shall I reap?" And of course he did. And what happened was that Jesus was resurrected from the dead as the first fruits of them that slept. So those ceremonies are very, very important. They may not actually sound important to us, but they most certainly are, because the people took no part in that ceremony. It was the priests alone. And so Jesus purchased our salvation on his own. he trod the winepress of God's wrath alone. And Jesus, of course, is slain before the foundation of the earth. Notice that when the sheaf is taken out of the field, there is a hole. And so when Jesus is raised from the dead, on very, very early on the Sunday morning, there is a hole, there is an empty tomb. Jesus has left, if you like, a point of reference so that we can see where he isn't. So Jesus severed all ties with the earth at that point, because he is going to eventually go back to heaven and is there now interceding at the hand of God. Now then, those 3 days that Jesus spent waiting in the grave, of course, is a picture that's given to us earlier on in the Gospels when the people ask for a sign, and Jesus says that no sign is going to be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah, who was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. So Jesus is in the earth. We know from the scriptures that he's not, even though his body is actually lying on a slab in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, his spirit and soul are incredibly busy. He promised the thief, for example, that he would be with him in paradise, which is a word that means the pleasure garden of a king. Then obviously he preached to the spirits that were in prison. That's in 1 Peter. And then we know that, of course, he took the keys of death and hell. All of these happened while he was actually in the tomb. It's 1 Peter 3:15, by the way, if you're looking for it. So during that time, what happened to the disciples? Well, they did what normal people do when you lose someone that you thought was going to be here forever. They went into mourning, and they were convinced, of course, that Jesus was dead, and they were also convinced that they were probably at risk as well, which is why they kept themselves holed up in this upper room. They were desolate, they were depressed, they were heartbroken. And the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 actually expressed that feeling. We thought, that he was going to be the Messiah, that he was going to liberate us, that he was going to be the answer to all our problems. And here we are, it's the 3rd day now. What has happened? So that 3rd day, in terms of the Israeli calendar, Jesus is crucified on the 14th. Then the 15th is the first day of unleavened bread. Then you have the 16th, which is a secular day. It's the only day that the ladies would have had a chance to prepare the spices, because then on Saturday you have the weekly Sabbath, and then of course the 17th of Nisan is Sunday. Now Paul says in that scripture that I read that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. And that wasn't something that Paul had just made out of his head, because Jesus actually said it to those 2 disciples that we talked about a few moments ago on the road to Emmaus. Luke 24 and verse 46 says this. Also, Jesus appeared and said, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the 3rd day." And undoubtedly that was something that he repeatedly told them throughout his ministry. This wasn't just a once-off occurrence. So I'm asking myself now, what actually happened in the Old Testament that was pointing towards this 17th of Nisan, this 3rd day that makes it so important? Well, I'm going to read you some. On the 3rd day, the earth brought forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants of every kind, and trees. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place, that's of course Mount Moriah, from afar off, where he is going to offer his son Isaac. And he says to his servants, "We will worship and we will return." On the 3rd day, Pharaoh releases his chief cupbearer from death row. On the 3rd day, Joseph releases his brothers from prison in Egypt. On the 3rd day, the Israelites request Pharaoh's permission to make a 3-day journey into the desert to worship God. On the 3rd day, plague 9, which is of course the plague of darkness, in Egypt ends, but there was light for all the dwellings of the Israelites. On the 3rd day, God descended to Mount Sinai with fire and the sound of the shofar, and of course gives what we call the 10 Commandments, but which the Jews refer to as the 10 words. On the 3rd day, the Israelites were to purify themselves from being in contact with the dead. That's in Numbers 19. On the 3rd day, after coming to the river and preparing to cross, they entered the promised land. And on the third day, Joshua's spies emerge from hiding and come back to their commander. On the third day, King Hezekiah is healed of his fatal disease and offers thanks in the temple. On the third day, of course, Jonah is expelled from the belly of the fish. And finally, after fasting, Esther puts on royal apparel and enters the palace of the Persian king Xerxes in order to thwart the death plot on her people. And that happened, guess when? On the third day. So it is incredible that all these amazing events happened. Just one more. The ark landed on Mount Ararat also on the 17th of Nisan. So you can see that what God does is he prepares people for 2 days, and then there's this climatic event which is called the third day. The day when people are delivered, the day when things go into reverse, and what was dark and terrible, prison and captivity, turns into release and joy and happiness. The third day is when new life comes out of death, when the earth sprouts and there is healing and there is restoration and release. So God orchestrates this dramatic third day event in these 2 days, when, as I said, the powers of darkness and the powers of chaos seem to make us all hopeless. Here it is, the third day happens, and now suddenly we are full of hope because the hope giver has come. Because the first 2 days don't tell the whole story. God reserves that for this third day. So death is turned into life, defeat is turned into victory, judgment is turned into blessing and release. And so it is on the 17th of Nisan, the third day, that Jesus rises from the dead and conquers the devil's dark powers and cancels sin and death so that it cannot reign anymore in our hearts. Today is a shout of victory. Today is a day for all those who love God to shout his triumph. So what exactly does that resurrection, that third day, mean to you and me today in 2020, surrounded by all the difficult circumstances that we are in? Well, first of all, can I say that the sin offering that Jesus offered on the cross is obviously now accepted, because death now has no hold on Jesus and he is alive. He has absolved us from the power of sin. He has left the grave, and the resurrection is proof of that. I have written down here, the law condemned sin, and so Jesus died accepting the wages of our sin, but Jesus is a spotless sacrifice. And so the minute the law is satisfied, Jesus is vindicated. He renders death powerless. O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory? Psalm 85 verse 10 says this, unfailing love and truth have met on their way. Righteousness and peace have kissed one another. Here is the triumph of redeeming love. So Jesus' sacrifice is accepted. Then Jesus is vindicated. God has exalted him, it tells us in Philippians, and given him a name which is above every other name. In Acts chapter 2, Peter speaking on the day of Pentecost, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. Then, of course, there is the victory that Jesus has won for us over death, because Jesus emerges from the grave in a body, a resurrected body, an incorruptible body, an eternal body, but still in a physical body. And so if Jesus has a new body which will last for eternity, that is what he promises to you and me. We will receive eternal life and a brand new body. Isaiah 26 and verse 19 says this, but your dead will live. Their lifeless bodies will rise again. You will sleep in the dust yet. Get up and shout for joy. The dew of a new day will wash your glistening flesh, and the earth will push forth those who have passed away. Corruption is going to put on incorruption. Mortality is going to be clothed in immortality, and death is going to be swallowed up in victory, all because of today. Jesus is not just Lord of the living, but he is also the one who can raise the dead. And that is something that can only be said about Christianity. No other world faith can say that its leader is alive. Their graves are most certainly full. But death could not hold Jesus, so he arose. And Jesus is exalted. He was proved to be the God that he said he was, because God cannot die. In the incarnation, Jesus emptied himself of everything on the outside that showed that he was God. He didn't go around glowing. He went around as an ordinary human being. He became, Isaiah says, one who had no reputation. And yet at the resurrection, all his rights, all his privileges are restored to him. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 4, he was sheer weakness and humiliation when he was killed on the cross. But oh, he is alive now in the mighty power of God. And then Jesus is also Lord of Satan. He was seemingly conquered and destroyed. It looks as if the cross is Satan's final victory over Satan. And yet Resurrection Day is where Jesus turns the table. And now Satan has no power over him, and therefore he has no power over us either. Colossians chapter 2 and verses 14 and 15 say this: having cancelled out the certificate of debt consisting of legal demands which were in force against us and which were hostile to us. And this certificate he has set aside and completely removed by nailing it to the cross. And when he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, those supernatural forces of evil operating against us, he made a public example of them, exhibiting them as captives in his triumphal procession, having triumphed over them through the cross. I can remember many years ago preaching on that passage in Sure Hope, when we were actually allowed to stand in a pulpit and have people around us on a Sunday morning after we had done a ladies' conference. An absolutely incredible passage. So now we live, because of Resurrection Sunday, we live on another level of reality, free from the law of sin and death. And this is our destiny, that one day we will also be free from the environment of sin, because of course Jesus is coming to take us to be with himself, and then we shall see him and we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. He was born to bear our griefs, our sorrows, our sin, but he became the plunderer of Satan's kingdom, the downfall of his evil plan. He is the conqueror of death's dark power and the rescuer of fallen man. And today we are giving him honor. Today we are giving him glory, because he lives. We will live also. Because he lives, we can face tomorrow irrespective of what it brings, because the resurrection is tomb blasting, death defying power, and it is ours because the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is residing in every one of us. Romans 8:11 says this, and I'm going to close. It stands to reason, doesn't it, that if the alive and present God who raised Jesus from the dead moves into your life, he will do the same thing in you that he did in Jesus, bringing you alive to himself. And when God lives and breathes in you, and he does, as surely as he did in Jesus, you are delivered from that dead life. With his spirit living in you, your body will be as alive as Christ's. Today is a day of victory. Today is a day of triumph, because Jesus is Lord of all. May God bless you. Amen.